Most people don't realize how noisy their inner world has become until a quiet moment suddenly feels uncomfortable. The mind jumps from one thought to another, replaying old conversations, worrying about things that haven't happened, and inventing problems that don't actually exist in the present moment. What feels exhausting isn't usually life itself, but the constant mental commentary layered on top of it. The central idea explored here is simple but profound. The mind does not need to be fought, suppressed, or endlessly analyzed. It needs to be directed. And once you understand how quickly attention can be shifted, you realize that control doesn't require years of struggle or extreme discipline. It begins with awareness and a few deliberate choices made in real time. The mind operates largely on habit. Thoughts repeat not because they are true or useful, but because they are familiar. Over time, these patterns become automatic, and people start believing they are their thoughts instead of recognizing thoughts as passing mental events. This is where suffering quietly takes root. When a negative thought appears, it often pulls the body along with it, tightening the chest, speeding up the breath, and creating a sense of urgency or fear. The key insight is that thoughts gain power only when attention feeds them. The moment attention is withdrawn, even the strongest mental loop begins to weaken. Control, in this sense, is not force. It is selective focus. One of the fastest ways to interrupt mental chaos is to anchor attention in something immediate and physical. The mind is very good at living in imagined futures and reconstructed pasts, but it cannot dominate the present moment without cooperation. When attention moves fully into sensation, the grip of compulsive thinking loosens. Breathing becomes a powerful tool here, not as a mystical practice, but as a biological switch. A slow, deliberate breath signals safety to the nervous system. When the body calms, the mind follows. This is why a single conscious breath, taken with intention, can instantly shift emotional states that seemed overwhelming seconds earlier. Another important realization is that not every thought deserves engagement. The mind constantly offers commentary, opinions, and warnings, but most of it is redundant or exaggerated. Treating every thought as meaningful is like answering every notification on a phone the moment it appears. Mental discipline begins with discernment. Some thoughts require action. Most do not. The moment you stop arguing with unhelpful thoughts and simply let them pass, you reclaim a surprising amount of mental space. Silence, in this way, is not emptiness. It is clarity. Emotions are closely tied to thoughts, but they are not the same thing. Many people believe emotions control them, when in reality emotions are responses to interpretations. Change the interpretation, and the emotional response changes as well. This does not mean denying feelings or pretending everything is fine. It means observing emotions without being consumed by them. When anger, fear, or sadness arises, noticing it as a temporary state rather than a personal identity reduces its intensity. Emotions move like waves. Resistance makes them crash harder. Allowing them to pass shortens their duration. Attention is the real currency of the mind. Whatever receives attention grows stronger. This applies equally to confidence and doubt, calm and anxiety, focus and distraction. When attention is repeatedly placed on problems without solutions, the mind becomes trained to search for threats. When attention is intentionally placed on solutions, skills, or learning, the mind adapts in that direction. This is not blind optimism. It is strategic focus. Over time, the mind becomes more efficient at producing the kind of thoughts it practices most often. One subtle but powerful concept explored is the difference between reaction and response. Reaction is automatic and emotional. Response is conscious and deliberate. The gap between the two is where control lives. That gap can be widened through simple pauses. A brief pause before speaking, deciding, or acting creates space for clarity. In that space, better choices become available. This is especially important in moments of stress, where impulsive reactions often lead to regret. Mastery of the mind is less about eliminating emotion and more about choosing behavior despite emotion. External circumstances are rarely the true source of distress. Two people can face the same situation and experience completely different levels of suffering. The difference lies in interpretation. When events are seen as personal attacks or permanent failures, stress intensifies. When they are seen as temporary challenges or neutral facts, the modern world constantly pulls attention outward, fragmenting focus through noise, screens, and endless information. This makes inner control more important than ever. Without intentional boundaries, the mind becomes reactive and scattered. Choosing when to engage and when to disconnect becomes an act of self-respect. Mental clarity is not found by consuming more, but by filtering better. Fewer inputs often lead to deeper thinking and calmer states. Identity also plays a role in mental control. When people define themselves by their thoughts, emotions, or past experiences, change feels threatening. But identity can be loosened. You are not the voice in your head. You are the awareness that hears it. This shift alone creates distance from self, criticism, and mental pressure. When mistakes happen, they become events rather than definitions. Growth becomes possible without self-punishment. Instant control does not mean permanent calm. It means having tools that work when needed. A single moment of awareness can stop a downward spiral before it gains momentum. With practice, these moments become more frequent and more natural. The mind begins to trust direction instead of chaos. What once felt uncontrollable starts to feel manageable. As this understanding deepens, a question naturally arises. If attention shapes the mind so powerfully, what happens when it is deliberately trained over time rather than used only in moments of crisis? The next stage moves beyond interruption and into long-term mastery, where calm becomes a baseline rather than a temporary relief. There comes a moment when you realize that calming the mind in emergencies is useful, but living from constant recovery mode is exhausting. True control begins when steadiness becomes the default, not something you chase after things fall apart. This shift doesn't happen by adding pressure or rigid discipline. It happens by quietly retraining where attention goes when nothing dramatic is happening. What you practice in ordinary moments becomes what you rely on in difficult ones. The mind learns through repetition, not through understanding alone. You can intellectually grasp every idea about awareness and still feel overwhelmed if daily habits keep reinforcing distraction and emotional reactivity. This is why small, consistent practices matter more than intense effort. When attention is gently guided back again and again, the mind begins to follow more easily. Over time, focus becomes less of a struggle and more of a natural state. One of the most underestimated habits is how people begin their day. The first few minutes after waking often set the tone for hours. If the day starts with mental noise, urgency, or digital overload, the mind carries that agitation forward. A slower beginning, even just a few quiet breaths or moments of stillness, gives the nervous system a different signal. It communicates that there is no immediate threat, no need to rush. From that place, decisions become clearer and reactions soften. Thoughts lose much of their power when they are observed early. A single anxious idea, if noticed immediately, can dissolve before it builds momentum. Left unattended, it multiplies. The practice is not to stop thoughts from appearing, but to recognize them before they turn into stories. Stories create emotional weight. Raw thoughts, when seen clearly, are light and fleeting. This awareness becomes sharper with time, like developing an ear for subtle sounds that once went unnoticed. Another layer of control comes from understanding how the body stores tension. Mental stress often lives physically in the shoulders, jaw, stomach, or breath. Ignoring the body keeps the loop alive. When physical tension is released intentionally, the mind follows. Simple actions like relaxing the jaw, slowing the breath, or adjusting posture send immediate feedback to the brain. Calm is not just a mental achievement. It is a whole system response. There is also a deeper level of freedom that comes from questioning urgency. Many thoughts present themselves as emergencies, demanding immediate attention. But urgency is often an illusion created by habit. When everything feels urgent, nothing truly is. Learning to pause and ask whether something actually requires action right now weakens anxiety at its root. Most situations improve with a little space. Very few are made worse by calm consideration. As control strengthens, the relationship with discomfort changes. Instead of trying to eliminate unease, you begin to tolerate it without panic. Discomfort loses its authority when it is no longer treated as a command. This is especially important for fear-based thoughts. Another quiet shift happens when attention is redirected from self-monitoring to engagement. Excessive self-focus amplifies mental noise. When attention moves into what you are doing rather than how you are doing, thinking naturally quiets. Whether it's work, conversation, or a simple task, full presence reduces internal commentary. The mind is calmer when it is absorbed rather than evaluating itself. Over time, emotional triggers begin to lose their sharpness. Situations that once caused immediate reactions now create a pause instead. In that pause, choice appears. You may still feel irritation, sadness, or doubt, but they no longer dictate behavior. This is not emotional numbness. It is emotional maturity. Feelings are experienced fully, but they pass through rather than take over. Control also deepens when expectations are softened. Much of mental suffering comes from rigid ideas about how things should be. When reality deviates from expectation, frustration follows. Releasing unnecessary expectations doesn't mean lowering standards or ambition. It means reducing mental friction. Life becomes easier to navigate when outcomes are met with flexibility rather than resistance. As awareness stabilizes, a subtle confidence develops. Not confidence based on outcomes, approval, or certainty, but confidence in your ability to handle whatever arises. This inner trust reduces the need to control external circumstances. The mind relaxes when it knows it can adapt. Ironically, this relaxation improves performance, decision making, and emotional balance. Eventually, control stops feeling like control at all. It feels like alignment. Thoughts arise and pass. Emotions move without disruption. Attention flows where it's needed. The inner environment becomes quieter, not because life is quieter, but because the mind is no longer fighting itself. This is where clarity becomes sustainable rather than temporary. Yet even here, another question quietly waits beneath the surface. If the mind can be guided so effectively, what happens when attention is no longer centered on thoughts at all, but on the awareness behind them? That exploration leads beyond management and into a deeper form of freedom, where control gives way to something even more stable. At a certain point, it becomes clear that managing thoughts is only a transitional stage. Helpful, yes, but not the final destination. Beneath all thinking, beneath emotions, habits, and reactions, there is something far more stable that rarely gets attention. When awareness shifts toward this underlying presence, control stops being something you do and starts being something you rest in. The mind still functions, but it no longer feels like the center of who you are. Most people experience brief glimpses of this without realizing it. Moments when time seems to slow, when attention is fully absorbed, when there is no internal commentary narrating the experience. These moments often happen during simple activities, deep concentration, or quiet reflection. In those moments, there is no effort to control the mind because there is nothing to control. Thought either pauses or becomes background noise. What remains is a sense of clarity that feels natural and unforced. The key shift here is recognizing that awareness is constant, while thoughts are not. Thoughts appear, change, and disappear. Awareness stays. When this is seen directly, identification loosens. You stop being pulled into every mental movement because you are no longer standing inside the stream. You are observing it from the bank. This does not make life distant or dull. In fact, it often makes experiences richer, because attention is no longer split between living and thinking about living. From this perspective, negative thoughts lose their emotional charge. They may still arise, but they don't feel personal. They are recognized as conditioned patterns rather than truths. Without belief, they fade quickly. This is why deep control often feels effortless. There is nothing to resist. Resistance is what gives thoughts their weight. When resistance drops, thoughts behave like passing weather rather than permanent conditions. Silence plays an important role here, not the absence of sound, but inner silence. This silence is always present beneath thought. It can be noticed in the gap between breaths, in the pause before a reaction, or in the stillness after a thought ends. Spending time noticing these gaps trains attention to rest instead of wander. Over time, the gaps widen naturally, and the mind becomes less compulsive. This state also changes how challenges are experienced. Problems still exist, but they are approached from clarity rather than agitation. When the mind is not busy defending an identity or avoiding discomfort, solution. Another important shift happens in how emotions are processed. Emotions are no longer something to be fixed or analyzed. They are sensations moving through awareness. When they are allowed without judgment, they complete their cycle faster. Suppressed emotions linger. Observed emotions dissolve. This creates emotional stability that doesn't rely on external circumstances being ideal. As this deeper awareness stabilizes, fear of the mind itself disappears. Many people fear losing control, going too far, or falling apart internally. But when you are grounded in awareness, the mind feels less threatening. You realize it cannot overwhelm what you are. This creates a profound sense of safety that is internal rather than dependent on control strategies. Daily life begins to feel simpler. You listen more fully. You speak more deliberately. You act with less inner conflict. Even busy environments no longer feel as draining because you are not absorbing everything mentally. Boundaries form naturally. You engage without overextending. Rest becomes deeper, even in short moments. Importantly, this is not a permanent state of stillness or detachment. Thoughts return when needed. Planning happens. Memory functions. The difference is that thinking becomes a tool instead of a default mode. You use it intentionally and set it down when it's no longer useful. This flexibility is real freedom. As identification continues to loosen, self-judgment fades. Mistakes are seen clearly without becoming heavy. Growth becomes easier because there is less emotional resistance. Learning happens faster when the ego is quiet. Progress feels lighter, not forced. Eventually, the idea of controlling the mind transforms entirely. Control implies effort and opposition. What remains instead is understanding. The mind is no longer something to dominate or suppress. It's something to guide gently and sometimes simply observe. Awareness becomes the stable center from which everything else moves. This raises a final, quiet curiosity. If peace and clarity are available beneath thought, independent of circumstances, how might life unfold when this becomes the primary way of being, not just something visited in moments of reflection? That question opens the door to a way of living where inner stability and outer action no longer feel separate. When this way of seeing becomes familiar, life no longer feels like something that needs to be constantly managed from the inside. There is a noticeable reduction in friction, as if the mind has stopped arguing with reality. What remains is a steady attentiveness that moves with situations instead of resisting them. This is where inner control quietly matures into inner alignment, and effort gives way to ease. One of the most striking changes is how quickly balance returns after disturbance. Stressful moments still arise, but they no longer linger. Recovery becomes almost immediate. This isn't because emotions are suppressed, but because they are no longer fed with repetitive thinking. The nervous system learns that it can settle without needing a reason. Calm becomes the default state, not because life is calm, but because the mind knows how to return to center. Relationships begin to shift as well. When inner noise quiets, listening deepens. Conversations feel less reactive and more present. Instead of preparing responses or defending positions, attention stays with what's being said. This alone reduces conflict. Many misunderstandings dissolve simply because they are not being filtered through emotional projections. You start seeing people as they are, not as your thoughts interpret them. There is also a change in how ambition and goals are experienced. Drive no longer comes from restlessness or fear of falling behind. It comes from clarity. Action feels cleaner when it isn't fueled by internal pressure. You still work, build, and improve, but without the constant sense of urgency. Productivity often increases because energy is no longer wasted on mental resistance or self-doubt. Time itself seems to be experienced differently. Without constant mental commentary, moments feel fuller. You are not rushing through the present to get to the next one. Even ordinary activities carry a sense of depth. This doesn't make life slow or passive. It makes it precise. Attention is where it needs to be, when it needs to be there. Another subtle shift is in how uncertainty is handled. The need to have everything figured out begins to soften. You become more comfortable not knowing, trusting that the body continues to play an important role here. With less mental tension, physical habits naturally adjust. Breathing deepens. Sleep improves. Movement becomes more fluid. The body and mind stop pulling against each other. This integration creates a sense of wholeness that many people chase through external changes, not realizing it was available internally all along. There is also a noticeable reduction in self-importance, but not in a diminishing way. It's a relief. When everything is no longer taken personally, emotional burdens lighten. Praise and criticism both pass more easily. This doesn't create indifference. It creates balance. You can appreciate feedback without being defined by it. From this place, ethical behavior becomes simpler. You don't need rigid rules to guide you. Clarity naturally aligns actions with values. When the mind is quiet, it becomes harder to justify harmful behavior, even subtly. Integrity feels less like a discipline and more like a natural expression of awareness. Even difficult emotions take on a different role. Instead of being problems, they become information. Sadness, frustration, or fear are signals, not enemies. When listened to calmly, they point toward adjustment or understanding rather than collapse. Emotional intelligence deepens without conscious effort. Life still presents challenges. Loss, uncertainty, and change are unavoidable, but suffering becomes optional. Pain may arise, but it doesn't turn into prolonged mental struggle. This distinction changes everything. You begin to trust your capacity to move through life without being overwhelmed by it. At this stage, the idea of controlling the mind feels almost outdated. The mind is no longer an adversary. It's an instrument. Awareness holds it gently, using it when necessary and releasing it when it's not. This balance allows for both depth and functionality, stillness and action. And yet, even here, something continues to unfold. As awareness stabilizes further, there's a growing sense that this clarity is not something you've achieved, but something you've uncovered. It was always present, waiting beneath habits of distraction. This realization invites a final inquiry, one that doesn't seek improvement, but understanding. What happens when you stop trying to become better and simply remain present, moment by moment, without resistance? When striving falls away, what remains is surprisingly ordinary. There is no dramatic shift, no constant sense of bliss, no permanent emotional high. Life continues much as it did before, but it is met from a different inner posture. Instead of leaning forward into the future or backward into the past, attention settles into what is happening now. This simplicity is often overlooked because the mind expects transformation to feel extraordinary. In reality, the deepest changes feel natural, almost quiet. Presence begins to reveal itself in small, practical ways. You notice when the mind starts rushing and gently slow down. You sense when a conversation needs silence more than words. You recognize fatigue before it turns into frustration. These are not techniques anymore. They are signals that awareness picks up automatically. Life becomes less about correction and more about listening. With this listening comes a different relationship to thought. Thoughts are no longer treated as instructions or warnings that must be followed. They are seen as suggestions at best. Some are useful, many are outdated. When a thought arises about failure, success, or identity, it is evaluated calmly rather than believed instantly. This creates inner freedom without requiring constant vigilance. The mind self-regulates when it's not under pressure. There is also a softening of inner narratives. The stories you once told yourself about who you are, what you should be, or how things must unfold begin to loosen. This doesn't create confusion. It creates flexibility. You can adapt more easily because you are not defending a fixed self-image. Growth feels lighter when it's not tied to proving anything. Another important change is how effort is experienced. Action still requires energy, but it's no longer fueled by tension. You work because the work is there, not because you are trying to escape discomfort. Rest happens without guilt. Movement happens without force. This balance allows for sustainability. Burnout becomes less likely when motivation is clean. Moments of quiet become more valuable than stimulation. Not because stimulation is avoided, but because silence is recognized as nourishing. In silence, as identification with thought continues to dissolve, fear of missing out, falling behind, or not being enough loses its grip. These fears depend on comparison and future projection. When attention stays grounded, comparison fades. You measure progress by alignment rather than achievement. Satisfaction comes from coherence, not accumulation. This state also changes how you relate to time spent alone. Solitude is no longer something to fill or escape. It becomes a space where nothing needs to happen. In that space, the mind rests, and creativity often emerges spontaneously. Ideas arrive without force. Insights appear without searching. This is not because you're trying to be creative, but because the noise that blocks creativity has softened. Even conflict is experienced differently. When disagreement arises, the need to win or defend diminishes. You can express boundaries clearly without aggression. You can listen without absorbing negativity. This doesn't mean you avoid confrontation. It means confrontation happens without internal chaos. Over time, a quiet trust develops. Not trust that everything will go your way, but trust that you can meet whatever arises with clarity. This trust reduces anxiety more effectively than reassurance ever could. It's based on experience, not belief. The sense of self becomes more transparent. You still have a personality, preferences, and opinions, but they don't feel heavy. You can hold them lightly. This lightness makes life feel more spacious. You're less trapped inside your own mind. In the end, the idea of controlling the mind dissolves into understanding the mind. Control was never about dominance. It was about alignment with awareness. When awareness leads, the mind follows naturally. There is no struggle in this, only attentiveness. And from this attentiveness, a final realization gently settles in. Nothing new was added. Nothing was fixed. What changed was where attention rested. With that shift, the mind found its place, and life began to move with a quieter, steadier rhythm that no longer needed to be forced. At this stage, there is nothing left to chase. The restless feeling that once pushed you to seek answers, methods, or certainty has softened into something quieter and more grounded. Life continues to present movement, decisions, and change, but they are no longer interpreted as problems to solve internally. They are simply events to respond to. This subtle distinction marks the completion of the inner shift that began with the desire to control the mind. Attention now rests naturally in what is happening, without needing reminders. When thought appears, it is welcomed if useful and ignored if not. There is no resistance to thinking, and no attachment to silence. Both are allowed. This flexibility is what keeps the mind balanced. Control, in its old sense, would actually disturb this balance. What exists instead is a steady openness. There is also a clearer understanding of effort. You recognize when effort is needed and when it is unnecessary. You no longer push through situations that require patience, and you no longer wait passively in situations that require action. This discernment comes from presence, not analysis. The mind trusts awareness to guide timing. One of the most meaningful changes is how you relate to uncertainty about the future. Planning still happens, but anxiety about outcomes fades. You understand, through lived experience, that most suffering came not from what happened, but from the stories created around what might happen. Without those stories, the future feels open rather than threatening. Even the idea of self-improvement takes on a different tone. Growth continues, but without self-criticism. You see patterns clearly and adjust naturally. There is no internal conflict about being imperfect. Imperfection is simply part of movement. This acceptance removes the emotional weight that once made change difficult. You also become more sensitive to alignment. When something feels off, you notice early. You don't push through misalignment to prove discipline or strength. You adjust course quietly. This responsiveness keeps life simpler and prevents small tensions from turning into major struggles. The mind, once noisy and demanding, now feels like a companion rather than a commander. It offers thoughts when needed and stays quiet when not. You no longer feel at its mercy. But more importantly, you no longer feel the need to dominate it. Mutual cooperation replaces control. There is a deeper appreciation for ordinary moments. Not because they are romanticized. When difficulties arise, you meet them with steadiness rather than tension. Pain may be present, but mental resistance is minimal. This distinction continues to be one of the most liberating realizations. You can experience challenge without being consumed by it. Eventually, the original question of how to control the mind feels almost irrelevant. The mind was never the enemy. It was misunderstood. Once seen clearly, it settles into its proper role. Awareness leads. Thought supports. Life unfolds. What remains is not a conclusion, but a way of being. A quiet attentiveness that moves with life rather than against it. There is no finish line here, no final achievement. Just an ongoing presence that meets each moment as it comes, without resistance, without force, and without the need to control what was never truly out of control. What follows after all of this is not silence in the dramatic sense, but something more usable. A steadiness that stays even when the mind is active. You move through the world without the constant need to check yourself internally, without asking whether you are calm enough, aware enough, or doing things the right way. That self-monitoring fades, and with it, a large portion of unnecessary mental effort disappears. Life begins to feel less like a performance and more like participation. You're not standing outside your experience trying to manage it. You're inside it, responding naturally. This doesn't make you careless or passive. It makes you precise. When action is needed, it happens. When rest is needed, it's taken. The mind no longer argues with what the moment requires. One of the quiet markers of this stage is how rarely you feel the urge to explain yourself, even internally. Justification used to consume a lot of energy. Defending choices, replaying conversations, proving points that no one asked for. As awareness stabilizes, that habit weakens. You do what makes sense, adjust when necessary, and move on. Mental closure comes faster because there's less emotional residue. You also become more attuned to truth, not in a philosophical sense, but in a practical one. You notice when something feels honest or forced, aligned or misaligned. This sensitivity guides decisions more reliably than overthinking ever did. It's not intuition as a mysterious concept, but intuition as clarity unobstructed by noise. There is also a deeper compassion that develops, both toward yourself and others. When you see how much of human behavior is driven by unconscious thought and emotional habit, judgment softens. You don't excuse harmful behavior, but you understand it better. This understanding reduces inner conflict. You respond firmly when needed, but without bitterness. The mind still produces opinions, preferences, and plans. That doesn't stop. What stops is the belief that these mental movements define you. They're tools, not identities. You can change your mind without feeling unstable. You can admit uncertainty without feeling weak. Flexibility becomes a strength rather than a threat. At this point, practices and techniques often fall away on their own. Not because they were wrong, but because their purpose has been served. They trained attention until attention no longer needed training. Awareness now corrects itself naturally. When distraction happens, it's noticed quickly. When tension arises, it's released without drama. There is also a subtle gratitude that appears, not directed at anything specific, but toward the simplicity of being present. You're no longer waiting for life to start or improve before you can be at ease. Ease is available now, within the moment as it is. That realization alone changes how everything is experienced. Importantly, this does not make life immune to loss or difficulty, but it changes how deeply those experiences imprint on the mind. Pain is felt, grief is honored, challenges are faced. What's absent is the extra layer of resistance that once turned pain into prolonged suffering. recovery becomes more natural, less forced. In the end, the idea of instantly controlling the mind reveals its deeper meaning. Instant control was never about domination or suppression. It was about recognizing, in any moment, that attention can return to awareness right now. Not later. Not after fixing something. Now. That option is always available. And once that is truly seen, the search ends quietly. Not with a dramatic conclusion, but with a settled understanding. The mind has. What remains now is not a method or a mindset, but a lived orientation. Attention rests where life is actually happening. And because of that, there is less mental commentary about how things should be. Experience is met directly. This directness brings a kind of quiet confidence that doesn't announce itself. It's felt as steadiness, not as certainty. The mind still thinks, imagines, evaluates, and plans. That function doesn't disappear, and it doesn't need to. The difference is that thinking no longer spills into every moment. There are clear boundaries now. Thought appears when invited and fades when its role is complete. This makes space for something many people miss: simple awareness without interpretation. With this space, sensitivity increases. You notice subtle shifts in mood, energy, and attention. Because they are noticed early, they don't escalate. Irritation dissolves before it hardens. Fatigue is respected before it turns into burnout. This early awareness prevents many problems before they ever fully form. There is also a change in how motivation operates. Instead of being driven by pressure or fear, action is guided by clarity. You do what needs to be done because it's the next obvious step, not because you are trying to escape discomfort or reach an imagined future. This makes effort sustainable. You can move consistently without exhausting yourself. The relationship with silence continues to deepen. Silence is no longer something you create through effort. It's something you notice between thoughts, behind sounds, within activity. Even in busy environments, there is a sense of inner quiet that remains untouched. This is not withdrawal. It's stability. As this stability becomes familiar, there's less attachment to outcomes. You still care, but you don't cling. You invest effort, but you don't tie your sense of self to results. This balance allows you to engage fully while remaining free internally. Success and failure both pass through without defining you. There is also a clearer perception of limits. You know when to say no without guilt and yes without resentment. Boundaries form naturally because you are not trying to manage impressions or expectations. You respond to reality, not to imagined demands. This alone reduces a great deal of mental strain. The sense of time continues to soften. You are not constantly measuring progress or comparing moments. Each moment is complete in itself. This doesn't make you passive about the future. It makes you present while moving toward it. Planning becomes practical rather than anxious. Eventually, even the distinction between controlling the mind and letting it go fades. Both imply an effortful stance. What remains is attentiveness. A simple knowing of what is happening, inside and out, without resistance. From that knowing, appropriate action arises on its own. This attentiveness is not something you hold on to. The more you try to possess it, the more it slips away. It stays when it's not being demanded. It's available whenever attention relaxes into the present. That relaxation is the key, and it's always accessible. As this understanding settles, life feels less fragmented. There's continuity between thinking, feeling, and acting. You are no longer divided against yourself. This wholeness is not dramatic, but it is deeply stabilizing. And so the journey ends where it always was. Not in the future, not in some perfected state, but here, in awareness that there is a quiet ordinariness to this final stage that can be easy to miss if you're still looking for something extraordinary. Nothing new appears. No permanent emotional state announces itself. What changes is the absence of struggle. Life continues with its usual mix of simplicity and complexity, but the inner resistance that once made everything heavier has largely fallen away. Attention now moves fluidly between thought and awareness without friction. You can think deeply when required and rest fully when thinking is unnecessary. There is no anxiety about losing clarity because clarity is no longer something you try to hold. It reappears naturally whenever attention relaxes. This reliability creates a subtle sense of trust in your own inner stability. Even moments of distraction are no longer treated as failures. When the mind wanders, it's noticed without judgment and gently returns. There is no frustration in this movement. It's understood as part of being human. This kindness toward your own mind prevents the re-creation of old patterns of control and resistance. At this point, you may notice that silence feels less like a state and more like a background. Thoughts pass through it, sounds arise within it, actions happen from it. This background presence doesn't demand attention, but it's always available. Knowing this removes the fear of losing yourself in activity or emotion. The way you relate to meaning also changes. You're less concerned with defining purpose in abstract terms. Meaning is found in alignment rather than narrative. When actions feel coherent and present, they carry their own sense of rightness. You don't need to label them as meaningful for them to feel complete. There is also a deepening respect for simplicity. Complicated explanations and excessive mental frameworks feel unnecessary. You recognize when thinking adds value and when it only adds noise. This discernment keeps life clear and focused, even when circumstances are complex. You may also find that your presence affects others subtly. Not through advice or correction, but through calm. People often feel more at ease around someone who isn't internally reactive. This doesn't make you responsible for others' states, but it does create cleaner interactions. Communication becomes more grounded, less charged. The sense of identity continues to soften. You know who you are in practical terms, but you don't cling to a fixed story. This makes adaptation easier. Change doesn't threaten your sense of self because it was never built on rigid definitions to begin with. Importantly, this is not the end of learning or growth. It's the end of inner conflict around learning and growth. You remain curious, open, and responsive, but without the pressure to arrive somewhere else. Growth unfolds naturally when resistance is absent. The original desire to instantly control the mind now feels distant. Control was a useful doorway, but not the destination. What was really sought was freedom from unnecessary suffering. That freedom came not from force, but from understanding. In the end, what remains is a simple truth lived rather than stated. Awareness is already present. The mind is a function. By now, nothing feels unfinished, yet nothing feels closed. What's present is a sense of continuity rather than conclusion. Life is no longer divided into moments of clarity and moments of confusion. Even when confusion appears, it's held within awareness instead of fought against. This alone removes its sharpness. There is an ease in allowing experience to unfold without constantly interpreting it. You notice what's happening, respond where needed, and let the rest pass. The mind still offers commentary from time to time, but it doesn't dominate. It's like background music you can hear if you choose, but don't have to listen to. This ease brings a different kind of strength. Not the strength of willpower or control, but the strength of steadiness. You're less shaken by external events because your center isn't tied to them. Praise doesn't inflate you. Criticism doesn't collapse you. Both are received, considered if useful, and released. There's also a subtle humility that develops. You no longer assume you know how things should unfold. You stay open. This openness allows learning to continue without ego resistance. When new information appears, it's integrated calmly. When old beliefs fall away, they do so without inner conflict. The sense of being rushed by time fades further. You still respect deadlines and commitments, but internally there's less pressure. You're where you are, doing what you're doing. The future will arrive on its own. This reduces the constant feeling of being behind that once fueled anxiety. In relationships, this steadiness creates trust. People sense when they're being met without judgment or agenda. You're not trying to fix or manage them. You're simply present. This presence often does more than words ever could. Even solitude changes in quality. Being alone no longer feels like absence. It feels complete. There's no need to fill the space with stimulation or distraction. Quiet moments are restful because the mind isn't searching for something to hold on to. At this point, effort and non-effort blend. You act decisively when needed and rest without guilt when action is unnecessary. There's no internal debate about whether you're doing enough or being enough. That question no longer feels relevant. The mind, once the source of tension, now feels like a practical instrument. It solves problems, remembers details, and plans when appropriate. Outside of that, it rests. You don't need to manage this consciously. It happens because awareness has taken the lead. If there is a final understanding here, it's this: peace was never something to achieve. It was what remained when unnecessary mental effort stopped. Control was a step. Awareness was the shift. Simplicity was the outcome. And from this simplicity, life continues. Not perfectly, not without challenge, but without the inner struggle that once made every. What follows after this is not a new insight, but a lived quietness that doesn't ask to be named. There is no longer a sense of arriving somewhere or maintaining a state. Life is experienced directly, without the constant mental check of whether things are right or wrong inside. That checking was the final layer of noise, and its absence feels like relief more than achievement. You begin to notice how little effort is actually required to live well. Most of what once felt necessary was driven by fear of losing control, fear of falling behind, fear of not being enough. As those fears dissolve, behavior simplifies. You take care of what's in front of you. You rest when rest is needed. You speak when clarity calls for words and stay quiet when it doesn't. There is also a deeper acceptance of human limits. You no longer expect yourself to be endlessly focused, calm, or clear. Fluctuation is understood as natural. Some days are sharp, some are slow, neither defines you. This acceptance prevents the mind from turning normal variation into a problem. The relationship with thought has settled into something almost neutral. Thoughts are neither enemies nor guides by default. They're tools. When a useful one appears, it's used. When an unhelpful one appears, it passes. There's no emotional charge attached to either. This neutrality is what keeps the mind light. You may notice that the desire to explain these changes to others is minimal. Not because they aren't meaningful, but because they don't translate well into concepts. They're lived, not argued. Presence communicates itself quietly, without instruction. There is also a sense of patience that wasn't cultivated deliberately. Waiting no longer feels like wasted time. Uncertainty no longer feels threatening. You trust that clarity will appear when it's needed, because it always has. This trust removes the pressure to force understanding prematurely. Life continues to challenge, surprise, and sometimes disappoint. None of that stops. What stops is the inner collapse that once followed those moments. You remain intact, even when circumstances are not ideal. This resilience isn't built through toughness, but through softness. Through not resisting what arises. If someone were to ask what changed, there wouldn't be a simple answer. Nothing specific was added. Nothing external was fixed. Attention simply stopped fighting itself. From there, everything reorganized naturally. And so the journey that began with the desire to instantly control the mind ends in a different place entirely. Not control, but ease. Not mastery, but understanding. Not effort, but alignment. What remains is ordinary life, lived without unnecessary tension. A mind that functions without dominating. Awareness that doesn't need to be. At this point, even the idea of a final stage feels unnecessary. Life is no longer experienced as a path with milestones, but as a series of moments that don't need to be improved before they can be lived. There is a gentle neutrality to experience. Not indifference, but balance. Pleasant moments are enjoyed without clinging. Difficult ones are faced without resistance. Both are allowed to pass. There is a noticeable reduction in mental storytelling. Events happen, and they are met directly, without being wrapped in layers of interpretation. This simplicity brings a surprising amount of clarity. Problems are addressed as they are, not as symbols of something deeper or more personal. This keeps the mind grounded in reality rather than imagination. You may also notice that attention has become less self-centered, not in a moral sense, but in a practical one. You are less occupied with how things reflect on you. This frees up mental space to engage more fully with the world as it is. Listening improves. Observation sharpens. Presence deepens. The sense of control that once felt urgent has fully dissolved into trust. Not trust in outcomes, but trust in awareness itself. You know that whatever arises can be met with clarity, even if it's uncomfortable. This trust removes the need to prepare mentally for every possible scenario. There is also a quiet realism that replaces idealism. You don't expect life to be smooth, but you also don't assume it will be overwhelming. You meet circumstances as they come, without exaggeration. This realism keeps expectations flexible and emotions stable. Even ambition feels different now. Goals still exist, but they don't carry the same emotional weight. You work toward them because they matter, not because your sense of worth depends on them. Success feels satisfying but not defining. Failure feels informative but not personal. At times, there may be moments of old patterns returning. Brief anxiety, distraction, or doubt. When they appear, they are recognized quickly and allowed to pass. There's no sense of regression, just movement. This gentleness toward yourself prevents unnecessary struggle. The mind has found its place. It supports daily life without trying to run it. Awareness remains the steady background, quiet but present. You don't need to hold on to it. It's already here. If there is anything resembling a conclusion, it's this: the peace that was sought through control was always available through understanding. When attention stopped trying to dominate experience and instead rested within it, clarity emerged naturally. Nothing needs to be resolved beyond this. Life continues. Moments come. What becomes clear now is that nothing needs to be added to this way of being. There is no missing piece, no final insight waiting somewhere ahead. The mind, once treated as something to fix or control, has settled into its natural rhythm. Thought arises when needed, rests when not. Awareness remains steady, without effort. Life feels less like a problem to solve and more like something to participate in. You respond to situations as they arise, without rehearsing or replaying them internally. This makes actions cleaner and emotions lighter. There is less mental residue left behind after each experience. You may notice that attention is no longer pulled so easily by noise, drama, or urgency. Not because you are detached, but because you are grounded. Distractions still exist, but they don't hook into the mind as deeply. You choose where attention goes instead of losing it unconsciously. There is also a growing appreciation for subtlety. Loud experiences no longer feel more important than quiet ones. Small moments carry the same weight as major events because they are experienced fully. This creates a sense of richness without excess. The need to evaluate progress has faded. You are no longer measuring how calm you are or how aware you've become. Those measurements belong to the earlier phase of effort. Now, awareness simply notices what is present and responds appropriately. That is enough. In this space, kindness becomes more natural. Toward yourself, first. When mistakes happen, they are addressed without harshness. Toward others, as well. You recognize that most behavior comes from unconscious patterns rather than intention. This understanding softens reactions without weakening boundaries. The mind still offers opinions and preferences, but they don't carry the same urgency. You can hold a viewpoint without defending it. You can change your mind without feeling unstable. This flexibility brings a quiet confidence that doesn't need validation. There is also a deeper sense of rhythm in daily life. Work, rest, interaction, and solitude begin to balance themselves. You are less likely to push past limits or withdraw unnecessarily. This balance is not planned. It's felt. Even silence has changed its meaning. It's no longer something you seek to escape noise. It's recognized as the background of all experience. Sound, thought, and movement arise within it. Knowing this creates stability that isn't dependent on circumstances. The original desire to instantly control the mind has transformed completely. What was really needed was not control, but clarity. Not dominance, but understanding. When that understanding settled in, the struggle ended on its own. There is nothing more to conclude. Life continues to unfold, moment by moment. At this point, even the impulse to reflect feels softer. There is less need to look back and understand how things changed, because the change is no longer something you carry as a story. It's embedded in how you meet each moment. Awareness is not something you enter and exit. It's simply where experience happens now. The mind still produces noise from time to time. Old habits don't vanish completely, but when they appear, they don't take center stage. They are noticed, sometimes even smiled at, and allowed to pass. There is no disappointment in their return, because there is no expectation of perfection. That expectation belonged to an earlier version of you. Life feels more honest this way. Less polished, less managed, but more real. You respond to what's actually happening instead of what you think should be happening. This honesty removes a great deal of inner tension. You no longer need to maintain a version of yourself in your own head. There is also a quiet strength in not needing answers all the time. Some questions resolve themselves through living, not thinking. You've learned that clarity often arrives after patience, not effort. This understanding changes how you relate to uncertainty. It becomes something you move with, not something you rush to eliminate. The sense of separation between inner life and outer life continues to dissolve. Thought, emotion, and action are no longer in conflict. They operate together, guided by awareness rather than driven by fear. This integration creates a feeling of wholeness that doesn't depend on circumstances being ideal. You may notice that gratitude appears more often, without being practiced. Not gratitude for specific outcomes, but for the simplicity of being present. For the absence of unnecessary struggle. For the ease that comes from not fighting your own mind. Even ambition, when it arises, feels cleaner. You pursue what matters to you, but you are not consumed by it. You can engage deeply without losing yourself. This balance allows you to move forward while remaining grounded. The idea of instant control now reveals its quiet truth. Control was never about stopping thoughts or forcing calm. It was about realizing, in any moment, that attention can return to what is real. That return is instant. It doesn't require preparation. It doesn't depend on circumstances. It's always available. And so there is nothing left to add, refine, or complete. The mind has found its place. Awareness has taken the lead. Life continues, sometimes smooth, sometimes difficult, but no longer overwhelming. What remains is simple presence, meeting each moment as it comes, thinking when needed. Now there is a sense that even continuation itself is optional. Nothing feels unfinished, and nothing feels forced to come to an end. Experience flows on its own, without needing to be framed as progress or completion. You are simply here, responding to what life presents, without the internal pressure to make something of it. The mind still functions, but it no longer asks for constant supervision. It does what it's meant to do and then steps back. There is trust in this process, not because it's perfect, but because it no longer feels threatening. Even confusion, when it arises, is just another experience moving through awareness. It doesn't carry the weight it once did. You may notice that effort now appears only when it's appropriate. There's no background tension pushing you to optimize every moment or improve every thought. When action is required, it happens. When waiting is required, waiting feels natural. This alignment between inner state and outer action brings a quiet sense of coherence. There is also a deep acceptance of change. Moods shift, circumstances evolve, people come and go. None of this feels destabilizing in the way it once did. You adapt without losing your center, because your center is no longer built on fixed conditions. Even the idea of awareness itself fades into the background. You are no longer thinking about being aware. You are just living. Awareness doesn't need to be remembered when it has become the ground of experience. This is perhaps the most subtle shift of all. The desire to control the future weakens further. Planning remains practical, but mental rehearsal loses its appeal. You've seen too clearly how little control thinking actually provides over outcomes. What matters is responsiveness, not prediction. In this space, there is room for sincerity. You can admit uncertainty. You can say you don't know. You can change direction without inner conflict. This honesty keeps life fluid and real. Nothing about this state needs protection. It doesn't disappear if you get busy, emotional, or distracted. It's not fragile. It's simply what's left when resistance is absent. You may forget it at times, but it never truly leaves. If the journey began with urgency, it ends with ease. Not the ease of everything going your way, but the ease of not fighting what doesn't. This is the quiet resolution beneath the entire exploration. Life continues exactly as it always has, but without the extra layer of struggle that once felt inevitable. And in that simplicity, there is a freedom that doesn't announce itself, doesn't demand attention, and doesn't need to be named to be lived.